There's nothing worse than having a dull knife. It makes cutting vegetables a challenge, and it's actually easier to cut yourself with a dull knife than a sharp knife. Today I'm going to show you how to sharpen a knife using a whetstone. And if you're a beginner, I'm going to share with you some common mistakes that you can avoid making. Before you begin whetstone sharpening, you'll want to make sure that you're organized. Mistake number one is not having all of the essential gear before getting started. I'm going to run through all of the basics that you need to begin with whetstone knife sharpening. You'll want to have the right selection of whetstones. This is my Coarse grit stone. This one has the option of a 400 grit side and a 1000 grit side. 400 is going to be more coarse, and that's going to help to take down any nicks or scratches and really take down the metal quickly. The 1000 grit is not quite as coarse and will not take down as much of your knife as quickly. You'll also want to have a fine grit stone. My fine grit stone has a 3000 grit side and an 8000 grit side. German and French knives do well with a finish between 2000 and 4000 grit, whereas Japanese knives do better with 6 to 8000 grit for the finish. So you could get away with just having one whetstone, but I really recommend having two different whetstones, one that's specifically a coarse stone and one that's more of a fine stone. There are even lower grit stones such as this 220. It's not something I would recommend for a beginner, but if your knife is extremely dull or you need to repair nicks in the blade, this could be helpful. Just know that it will work very fast and you don't want to lose excess amounts of metal from your knife unnecessarily. So I would say a stone this grit is optional. It's not really necessary if you have a 400 or even 1000. Now this is called a flattening stone, and this is going to help preserve your whetstone and keep them in good shape. I'll show you how to use this. I also like to use a squirt bottle. This just makes it easy to keep the stone moist. A bowl full of water works just as well. This is just a nice, convenient item. You'll also need some way to stabilize your stone so that it doesn't move while you're sharpening. Each of my stones came with a little connecting rubberized surface that it fits into, so this helps to stabilize it. And then this fits into this bamboo base, so it's extra secure. This raises it off the surface I'm working on about 3/4 of an inch. I like to either have paper towels or an old towel on hand because this is messy work and you're going to need something to sop up water and something that's old so it doesn't matter if it gets all stained and dirty. You'll also need a vessel for soaking your whetstones. So this is just a plastic tub that works well. Something, of course, that will accommodate the stone to soak in water. Obviously, you're going to need a knife to sharpen. It should be a knife that's relatively dull. This fits the description. It can't even cut through paper. And maybe not your most expensive knife if you're a beginner and you want to practice on a less expensive knife. Some are fans of these angle guides. It's basically just a triangular piece of plastic that clips onto the back of your knife to give you a 15-degree angle. However, if you are going to clip that onto the back of your knife, I recommend applying a layer of Scotch tape to avoid scratching the back of your knife, because as you push this onto your knife and pull it off, it can very easily leave a scratch here. Personally, I'm a fan of freestyling it when it comes to the angle, and I'll show you more about that shortly. I also like to wear an apron to protect my clothes, and I keep a couple sheets of paper on hand to test the sharpness of my finished knife. Now this is a leather strop. There's lots of different opinions about knife sharpening out there, and some are avid fans of using the leather strop. Others recommend using rolled up newspaper, and some even use just a stropping method with a whetstone. This is one more item that I feel is optional. So now that we have all of our essential gear organized, we're going to soak our whetstone, which takes me to mistake number 2. A lot of beginners don't soak their stone long enough, or they soak a stone that doesn't even need to be soaked. If you have a splash and go stone, it doesn't need soaking at all. So just check with your stone's manufacturing instructions. And most soaking stones do need to be soaked for about 5 to 10 minutes, up to a maximum of 20 minutes or so. So I've got the bamboo base and the rubberized bottom, which I'm attaching onto the soaked stone. No worries if you don't have either of these. You can actually just Place your stone directly onto a damp towel or even onto a brick that's wrapped in a damp towel to raise it up off the counter level. We're going to place this on the counter. Make sure that the towel is slightly damp. That helps to give traction, that it will stick to the countertop a little better. And this is where it's handy to have our squirt bottle to just re-moisten the stone if it starts to dry out. And as I mentioned, you can either use some Scotch tape or you can even use painter's tape, which comes off a little easier off of the knife when you're finished with it. Put a little bit of tape on there if you're using the angle guide. You don't need to do this otherwise, but I just want to at least show you how this angle guide works in case you want to use it the first time to get a sense of that 15 degrees if you have a Japanese knife. 15 degrees is not enough. If you have a German or French knife, then you'll want a 20-degree angle. But always check the instructions that come with your particular knife to make sure you're using the correct sharpening angle for your knife. And here's the variation I just mentioned about using painter's tape instead of Scotch tape on the back of your knife if you're using the angle guide. I'm just remoistening my whetstone. I'm holding my knife with my dominant hand. I've got the handle of the knife in my right hand. I'm right-handed. And then I'm just resting my left fingers on the blade. Not applying much pressure here. Some videos talk about 4 to 6 pounds of pressure or more. I'm just using a light amount of pressure to work in sections here on the knife. And now that we've demonstrated our correct 15-degree angle, we can remove the tape and the angle guide. Since this knife is pretty dull, I'm working on the 400 grit side, and I'll work my way up to the 1000 grit side. So again, we're maintaining that 15-degree angle, comfortable grip on the knife, and once I've completed the entire edge of the blade, that's considered one pass. Now some will say to work 10 to 12 passes on one side before turning over to the other side. It's really going to depend on your knife and how dull it is. So while 10 to 12 passes might be enough in one case, your knife could require more or less passes. Now, this might look like I'm sawing back and forth with equal force, but I'm actually applying more pressure on the edge trailing part of the motion. When I'm pushing away from me with the edge toward me, at this point I'm going to use my flattening stone to create a little bit of extra grit here. This helps to lubricate the knife, and it helps to keep your whetstone in good shape, keeping it nice and even so that you don't develop those dips in the stone. With maintaining our angle, just keep in mind that the mistake you want to avoid here is not using a consistent angle. Whether it's 15 degrees or 16 degrees, don't drive yourself crazy. Just try to generally keep a consistent angle to your knife sharpening. And to some extent, you will probably intuitively feel where the angle is for your knife. Make sure you're sharpening from tip to the base, the heel of the blade, and we're gently sliding across the stone. What we're working to create here is something called a burr. A burr is a curved lip of metal that raises up on the opposite side of the blade. Once we create this on one side of the blade, we'll go ahead and flip the knife over and work on that on the other side. So we're building up a burr. Regarding the placement of my knife on the stone, I've been working with a 45-degree angle, but shortly when I turn the knife over, I'm going to switch to a 90-degree angle. In my case, after 12 to 15 strokes on one side of my knife edge, I'm going to flip my knife over and repeat this on the other side. And working with that 90-degree angle on this side, as opposed to the 45-degree angle on the other side, will give you a really dynamic edge to your knife. So at this point, we are avoiding mistake number 4, which is not using a consistent amount of pressure. We're getting into the Zen zone here, relaxing and enjoying ourselves, using a consistent angle and consistent pressure. which, as I mentioned before, does not have to be a lot of pressure. It can literally just be the weight of your non-dominant hand. Avoid mistake number 5, which is rushing the process. Take your time and you'll be glad you did, investing whatever time you need to get a nice sharp knife. This is well worth it. So after about 12 to 15 strokes on each side, I'm feeling a little bit of a burr there, and I'm happy with what I have done. You can always go back and do some extra passes though if you feel like you need to. And then I'm going to briefly rub my whetstone with my flattening stone again, just to keep a nice even surface on top. Some people like to draw a grid using a pencil or a Sharpie marker, and then once it's all evenly gone, that's how you know you've evenly rubbed the surface of the stone. After working on a low grit stone like the 400 grit, I could move along to a medium grit of 1000. So while I won't be filming my process on the 1000 grit stone, just know that this was the next step in my grit progression. I went from a 400 grit stone to the 1000 grit stone, where I repeated the exact same process that we just did with the 400. And now my next step will be a 3000, and I'll end with an 8000. And just to recap, the only reason I even used a 400 was that my knife was very dull, but normally you'd be fine just starting off with a 1000. Now we're soaking our high grit whetstone for at least a few minutes before using it. Always check your manufacturing instructions that come with the stone to find out the exact amount of time recommended. Basically, once the bubbles end, it's ready. So I'm going to repeat the sharpening process on the 3000 grit side of this stone on both sides, and then flip it over and use the 8000 grit side to really refine the edge of the knife and to smooth off that burr that we created. So I'm repeating that entire process that we just went through on this more fine, high grit stone on the 3000 grit side. And with your finer stones, your higher grit stones, be sure to check the package directions because they may not need to soak as long as the medium grit stones. They may not need to soak for 5-10 minutes, and actually you can sometimes damage a more delicate fine grit stone. If you soak them too long, they could potentially break as you're using them. So again, just always check your stone's directions to make sure that you're soaking it for the right amount of time and not over soaking it. And now I'm going to finish up with my 8000 grit side of the stone. This works beautifully with Japanese knives. And this will make it razor sharp and take away any burr that formed. So it'll just really leave my knife edge beautiful. And if you're feeling confused about grit progression, take a deep breath and just relax. Even if you just started with a 1000 grit and then progressed to either a 3000 grit stone for your finish on a French or German knife, or a 6000 grit for a Japanese knife, you'd be doing great. And of course we want to treat this stone with our nice flattening stone as well. And just like we did with the other grits, you're basically repeating about 12 to 15 strokes on each side of the blade, or until it's the desired sharpness that works for you and your knife. Once you've finished, be sure to wash and thoroughly dry your knife. Also make sure to wash and thoroughly dry your whetstones. I let them sit out on the counter on paper towels for a few days. Let's give our newly sharpened knife a test run and see what it can do to a piece of paper. Razor sharp, slicing through paper no problem, and cutting through vegetables as if they were butter. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.